August 17th, 1943. An Allied victory on Sicily became a contest of pride as much as strategy. When American forces under Patton reached Messina first, the call that crossed Churchill's desk didn't just announce a captured city. It announced a changing balance in Allied power and prestige. In the next few minutes, we trace without theatrics what happened: the planning, the race, the gossip, and Churchill's immediate, quietly seismic response.
By late spring 1943, the Mediterranean had become a stage for Allied politics as much as for military operations. Winston Churchill and his British staff conceived the Sicily campaign not only to eject Axis forces from the island, but to showcase British leadership in the Mediterranean and to shape Allied post-war influence. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, the public face of British land power, was cast by London as the spearhead. Across transatlantic cables, American planners and commanders, eager, driven, and watched by a newly assertive U.S. High Command, prepared to play a decisive but formally supporting role. What began in the map rooms and cables of early 1943 carried into rough Italian beaches. Logistics, timing, and timing's political consequences would all matter. George S. Patton approached operations as an engine of motion. Where some favored deliberate set-piece advances, Patton believed in relentless pressure. Seize the initiative, exploit gaps, and press on before the enemy could reorganize. In Sicily, this translated into brutal, fast turns across mountain roads and through towns, often risking supply lines in exchange for tempo. Patton's staff and officers would later admit there was an element of private competition. He knew British columns moved with ceremony and needed assurances of publicity. Patton moved with audacity and raw speed. That mentality turned routine operational decisions into what contemporaries sometimes called an unspoken race, a contest that was tactical but carried unmistakable symbolic freight.
Field Marshal Montgomery had his own vision. Tightly organized advances, lines of supply, publicity crafted to bolster British arms and reputation. In London and among British press circles, there was confidence that Montgomery's Eighth Army would be the first to enter Messina, the gateway off Sicily, and that the narrative would cement Britain's strategic stewardship in the Mediterranean. That expectation shaped timetables, press guidance, and diplomatic notes exchanged in Whitehall. But the terrain, the enemy's disintegrating cohesion, and the relentless push from Patton's Seventh Army created a fluid reality that plans could not fully control. When columns converged on the narrow approaches to the city, the theoretical order of victory turned into a race measured in hours.
By early August 1943, both Allied armies had exhausted themselves against a stubborn, melting Axis defense. Operation Husky, the July 9-10 amphibious landings, had achieved surprise and lodgment. But Sicily's jagged hills, narrow coastal roads, and collapsing yet still dangerous enemy formations turned advances into attritional slogging. Supply trains choked on mountainous passes. Fuel and ammunition shortages shaped commanders' choices. Patton's solution was uncompromising. Push hard even when supply lines strained, trusting mobility to outpace logistical friction. British formations, conditioned to set-piece operations and methodical consolidation, favored securing rear areas and creating measured, sustainable lines. Those differences in operational culture made the final sprint to Messina not simply a contest of strength, but of tempo and institutional temperament.
The approaches to Messina were literal bottlenecks, single coastal roads, steep ridgelines, and the Straits of Messina shimmering like a promise of escape for retreating Axis troops. Small delays, a blown bridge, a jammed column, and ambush clearing could convert hours into decisive gaps. Patton's columns frequently slipped by under cover of night or by forcing mountainous tracks the planners had marked as secondary. Meanwhile, Montgomery's units advanced with deliberate control, consolidating captured ground and maintaining orderly supply discipline. Both methods carried risk. Patton's speed could overextend and invite counterattack. Montgomery's caution could cede symbolic advantage. In the end, it was how commanders managed hours, not miles, that determined who would stand at Messina's docks first.
Behind the headlines lay a complex web of intelligence. Ultra-decrypts, air reconnaissance, and prisoner interrogations fed both Allied staffs, but interpreting this flood of information remained fraught. Montgomery's planning benefited from strong signals and logistic estimates. Patton's thrust sometimes exploited local tactical intelligence, a reported gap in retreating enemy lines, an abandoned coastal battery, or a timely airstrike that opened a mountain pass. Yet uncertainty persisted. Commanders made decisions on partial pictures, and the fog of war favored bold, decisive action as much as cautious consolidation. Political signals filtered down too. Knowing that prestige followed the first into Messina added pressure to seize opportunities even when information was imperfect. The result was a mix of calculated moves and opportunistic gambles that defined the race's last days.
In the hours of August 16th into the 17th, 1943, the campaign reached its climactic pulse. Patton's 7th Corps, having seized key coastal approaches and exploited rapid armored thrusts, pressed toward the narrow docks and ferry points. British 8th Army units under Montgomery, simultaneously pressing from the east and north, closed in with their own disciplined columns. Accounts from the field later emphasized how little separated the two armies in space, but how much separated them in rhythm. Patton's men sprinted for waterfronts and objective points, while Montgomery's formations methodically secured rear positions and prisoner processing. When the first dispatches crossed command lines announcing troops at the Messina quayside, the message carried more than location. It carried an emblem of momentum, and for many, the psychological edge of being first. In the dawn hours of August 17, 1943, the narrow quays at Messina became the campaign's measuring stick. Axis troops were streaming onto ferries bound for the Italian mainland. Smoke and diesel fumes hugged the strait as loading ramps slammed shut and boats strained under weight. On both Allied flanks, commanders read the same signals. The enemy was breaking, escape routes were congested, and the prize, control of the quays, lay in whoever moved with the keener sense of urgency. Patton's 7th Army, pushing hard along the northern axis, ordered rapid seizure of ferry approaches and docks. The British 8th Army pressed from the northeast to seal exits and take prisoners. When word came through that American troops had physically reached the Messina quayside first, it arrived as an operational fact with immediate political resonance. Winston Churchill received the reports inside an atmosphere thick with expectation and calculation. London had prepared for a narrative. Montgomery first into Messina, British leadership affirmed, diplomatic capital accrued. The message that Patton's men had taken the quays disrupted that tidy script. Contemporary cables and later memoirs accounts show Churchill's reaction mixed private surprise with quick political triage, the need to temper public reaction, to remind peers of Britain's broader strategic gains, and to reframe the significance of the event for British standing. Churchill, ever conscious of headlines and influence, moved from astonishment to measured diplomatic steps aimed at preserving Britain's prestige without provoking an Anglo-American rupture.
Patton's orders and after-action notes reveal both intent and theatricality. He had long emphasized speed and had instructed subordinates that the capture of Messina would confer symbolic as well as tactical advantage. A line in his staff directives reads like a command to seize momentum, and the newspaper column that momentum created. To critics, this looked like vanity. To supporters, it was straightforward recognition of war's informational dimension. Victories shaped morale, diplomacy, and inter-allied standing. Patton's approach wasn't merely showmanship, it was an operational calculus that leveraged surprise and muscle to force logistical collapses in enemy retreat. The result? Soldiers on the quayside, dispatch riders bearing the news, and commanders on both sides adjusting public statements to the new fact on the ground.
Montgomery's campaign method privileged precision, secured lines of supply, orderly processing of prisoners, and carefully choreographed publicity that would highlight British competence. When his Eighth Army arrived on Messina approaches, press officers moved to frame the advance as a vindication of methodical planning. But the optics of being second, even if seconds apart, carried sting. Monty's staff later argued that secured gains and minimized casualties justified their tempo, a view shared by many professional soldiers who value sustained operational control over headline grabs. For the British government, the challenge then became explaining a second-place arrival in ways that preserved national morale and the narrative that Britain remained indispensable in the Allied war effort. Once the capture was public, newspapers and radio across London, Washington, and Allied capitals parsed the meaning. Some editorials framed Patton's arrival as proof of American vigor and initiative. Others warned of the dangers of theatrical commanders shaping strategy for headlines. Comment threads among military circles rehearsed familiar tensions: speed versus control, national prestige versus coalition unity. Behind the media churn were real diplomatic calculations. London making quiet representations to Washington about future theater leadership. Washington asserting the effectiveness of American forces, and both capitals recalibrating messaging to maintain cohesion. The Messina episode thus rippled beyond a single harbor. It fed debates over who would lead future operations and how Allied victories would be framed to a war-weary public.
Patton's personal style showed up plainly in written orders and the tenor of his staff directives. Seize the initiative, move without waiting for perfect consolidation, and press the enemy while he still bled coherence. In Sicily, Patton explicitly framed the push for Messina as a matter of momentum and prestige. Operatives later quoted staff orders that urged using every means to reach Messina before the British. That language mattered. It transformed routine operational urgency into a psychological contest. For subordinate commanders, the effect was immediate. Risk tolerances changed, night moves were authorized, and marginal routes previously judged too dangerous were tried. In short, Patton converted tactical opportunity into strategic narrative by instructing his forces to make being first a deliberate objective.
Montgomery's staff did not mistake Patton's speed for superior strategy. They believed in minimizing risk and preserving combat power for the next campaign. Monty's operational calculus prioritized intact formations, secure lines of supply, and the ability to sustain pressure beyond an initial dash. From the vantage of professional staff officers, this was not merely caution, it was preservation of long-term combat effectiveness. When Monty's men approached Messina, they organized fields of fire, consolidated prisoners, and arranged for orderly resupply, believing that the price of haste could be paid in lives and lost cohesion. That difference in doctrine, tempo versus consolidation, explains why two armies could arrive at the same objective hours apart, yet leave with sharply different after-action assessments.
While Allied formations jockeyed for coastal control, the Axis executed a remarkably disciplined evacuation. From August 11 through 17, the Germans and Italians conducted night withdrawals across the strait, moving tens of thousands of troops, vehicles, and heavy equipment under artillery and air threat. The narrowness of the passage, the currents, and the heavy flak made interdiction difficult. Allied air and naval efforts inflicted losses, but could not halt the flow. That escape shaped the operational significance of Messina. The city's capture ended the campaign on Sicily, but did not annihilate the enemy as some had hoped. In operational terms, taking the quayside was decisive for occupation. Strategically, the Axis withdrawal preserved forces that would fight on the Italian mainland.
When news of Patton's arrival reached London, Churchill's response combined private vexation with political calculation. He recognized the raw fact: American troops were first on the quay, but he also saw that public outrage served little purpose and risked harming coalition cohesion. Churchill moved quickly to reframe the event within a broader narrative of Allied success in Sicily, capture of the island, the eviction of Axis forces, and a strategic opening for the Italian campaign. In private correspondence and war room notes, he registered the sting of being upstaged, but he balanced it against the strategic imperative of keeping Anglo-American cooperation on track. Prestige could be defended in nuance rather than headlines. That blend of emotion and statecraft defined his immediate reaction.
In the days after Messina, the press in Washington leapt on the image of American vigor. Front pages praised Patton's legions and his willingness to take the fight to the Axis. British newspapers, mindful of morale and the intricacies of coalition diplomacy, emphasized the broader victory, the conduct of the Eighth Army, and the cooperation that made the operation possible. Across op-eds and soldier letters home, the debate hardened into familiar themes. Was speed a virtue or a danger? And did single dramatic acts help or hinder the alliance? These media narratives mattered politically. They shaped public understanding, influenced parliamentary exchanges in London, and trickled into the strategic meetings that would determine command and allocation for subsequent Italian operations.
Messina closed Operation Husky and opened immediate questions about command roles in the Mediterranean. The Americans' ostensible triumph complicated previous assumptions. U.S. forces now demonstrated they could operate independently at operational speed, and that reality informed Allied planning for the Italian mainland. Command relationships. Who would plan the next amphibious operations? Who would supply them? And how joint publicity would be handled shifted subtly but unmistakably. For Churchill and other leaders, the message was clear. The U.S. would not remain a junior partner in practical effect, and Britain would have to negotiate influence in a landscape where American material and manpower increasingly shaped outcomes. Messina was a tactical objective. Its capture carved political leverage. In the immediate weeks after Messina, diplomatic cables and personal dispatches traveled faster than troops. London notified Washington with careful phrasing designed to acknowledge success while reminding partners of Britain's continuing strategic contributions in the Mediterranean. Washington replied with congratulations that foregrounded American performance and sustainment, supplies, shipping, and growing troop formations. Churchill's private notes show a leader keenly aware that dispatch tone mattered. Blunt celebration risked friction. Measured praise preserved coalition unity. Behind closed doors, ministers negotiated future command roles and the allocation of shipping and materiel for Italy. The Messina episode stiffened American confidence and nudged planners to treat U.S. forces as equal operational partners rather than mere auxiliaries.
Patton's presence at Messina amplified discussions about the role of commanders in the public eye. In the United States, his image was lionized, aggressive, effective, and decisive. Critics, including some professional soldiers, cautioned that flaunting speed risked overextension and could tempt commanders to pursue headlines at the expense of strategic cohesion. Patton himself seemed to accept the trade-off. Publicity boosted morale, recruitment, and domestic political support for continued operations. For coalition partners, however, the spectacle could complicate joint planning. The debate was practical, not merely rhetorical. How to harness battlefield initiative without letting information politics distort theater-level strategy. Messina made that question immediate and unavoidable.
Montgomery emerged from Sicily with professional standing intact, but Messina left a mark on public perception. Monty's methodical approach would win plaudits in staff studies and among officers who valued orderly advances and minimized casualties. Yet being beaten into Messina's quay by hours fed narratives that undercut some public enthusiasm. Montgomery responded by emphasizing the strategic results he had achieved: stabilized fronts, control of supply corridors, and prepared formations for the Italian campaign. In military circles, his reputation remained substantial. In public arenas, the episode underscored that even celebrated commanders could be vulnerable to the optics of a single dramatic moment. The lesson? Battlefield reputation rests on both outcomes and how they are presented to the world. Beyond generals and press, ordinary soldiers bore the campaign's burdens. Letters home, regimental diaries, and oral histories record exhaustion, cold nights on mountain tracks, and the sharp relief of survival. For many frontline troops, the competition between Allied armies mattered little compared to comradeship, ration shortages, and the grim mathematics of casualties and prisoners. Taking Messina's quay was a moment of relief and pride, but it did not erase the campaign's human cost.
In the months that followed, veterans from both armies emphasized mutual respect. Shared hardship forged bonds that outlasted political squabbles. In that human ledger, the race to Messina became a footnote to endurance and sacrifice. Military analysts distilled practical lessons from Sicily. Tempo can be decisive, but requires logistical depth. Battlefield publicity must be managed within coalition frameworks, and joint operations demand clarity over objectives and command relationships. The Sicilian campaign showed that rapid exploitation of gaps could produce outsized gains, but also that withdrawals could preserve enemy formations for future battles. Planners on both sides incorporated these findings into Italian campaign preparations. More emphasis on coordinated air-sea interdiction, tighter liaison staffs between national commands, and clearer rules of engagement for press and propaganda. In effect, Messina reframed how coalition warfare would be planned and presented in the months to come.
Historical memory soon mingled with myth. American narratives lionized Patton's dash as emblematic of U.S. vigor. British recollections emphasized steadiness and the broader strategic victory. Over time, the popular story simplified into headlines and hero images, while historians parsed nuance. Both armies contributed to Sicily's success, and operational choices reflected doctrine as much as personality. Messina's capture entered memoirs, regimental chronicles, and post-war exhibitions, each retelling selecting facts that fit national narratives. The result was a layered memory in which factual capture, political meaning, and personal recollection coexisted, sometimes comfortably, sometimes in tension.
August 17, 1943, stands as more than the date of a military objective seizure. It marks a turning point in Allied wartime dynamics. The race to Messina crystallized emerging American operational independence, tested British diplomatic resilience, and forced Allied planners to reckon with how battlefield tempo and publicity shaped geopolitics. Churchill's reaction, private discomfort followed by public statesmanship, captured the dilemma of coalition leaders to manage pride without sacrificing unity. In the longer sweep, Messina's quayside symbolized the shifting balance of power that would shape Allied strategy through 1944 and beyond. The harbor fell, but the implications rippled across strategy, diplomacy, and memory, a modest locale with an outsized place in the story of Allied victory.